So good afternoon, everyone. My name's Nick Collier. I'm the MD for the City of London, the Corporation London in Brussels, a sort of ambassador for the city to the EU, if you like. And welcome this afternoon on behalf of the EU-UK Forum, on behalf of Paul Adamson and the team at Encompass and Forum Europe. For those of you who don't know, the forum exists to foster and support debate between the UK and the EU following Brexit, and hopefully that's the last time we'll mention that word today, and an encouraging dialogue on shared challenges. And of course, perhaps the biggest shared challenge of our age is climate change and delivering net zero. So today we're going to talk about net zero from the perspective of the central banks. Delighted to have three fantastic speakers today. Let me introduce them quickly, and then I'll hand over to them. First of all, Sylvie Goulard, who is the Deputy Governor at the Banque de France in Paris. I'm sure Sylvie, to those of you, good afternoon, Sylvie.
Good afternoon.
In Brussels, we're familiar with you, Sylvie, from your time here in Brussels as a member of the European Parliament and a very active ALDE member of the Econ Committee. You then sadly left Brussels to join the Macron government in 2017, and you're now Deputy Governor at the Banque de France, and of course very active on the question of climate change. And again, for those who don't know, the Banque de France is the secretariat of what's called the Network for Greening the Financial System, which essentially is a very large group of central banks coming together to work on these issues and doing a fantastic job. Second speaker is Sarah Breeden from the Bank of England. Sarah is the Executive Director in charge of supervising the UK banks in the PRA. The Prudential Regulatory Authority is essentially the supervisory arm of the Bank of England, and she also leads the Bank of England's work on financial resilience in the face of climate change. And she's on the NGFS. In fact, you chair one of the working groups, don't you, Sarah? I think of the NGFS. And she has a long career in prudential regulation in the bank, and also actually you were in the hot seat during in the market department during the last crisis. And I should disclose, we used to work together a very long time ago. Let's not talk about that. And finally, to moderate today, Rhian Marie Thomas, who is the CEO, the first CEO of the Green Finance Institute, which was set up in the UK nearly 2 years ago now, with support from us and the City of London Corporation and the UK government. And is formerly the head of green banking at Barclays, where I think you pioneered green mortgages and the first green bond, I think, by a UK bank. And Rhian is a member of the TCFD as well. And so we at the corporation and Rhian Marie at the GFI working very closely with Mark Carney, who's the kind of green finance envoy of both the UK government and the UN in the run-up to COP26. So I hope that the panel will talk a little bit about what we can expect on green finance from COP26 later on. So please do post your questions in the chat box, and I'm going to hand over now to Rhian Marie. Thank you all very much.
Thank you, Nick, and good afternoon, everybody. I'm delighted to be joining Sarah and Sylvie. So much we could talk about on this topic. Greening finance, financing green, roles of central banks as corporate, driving the agenda internationally. We've got the G7, G20, COP26 all coming up, as well as topics of system-wide change that obviously Nick touched on in both your roles with the NGFS. So to try and bring some order to all of that, I'm going to start with the first question, which is, what do you think the key areas of focus are when it comes to ensuring that the financial sector itself is resilient to climate change? And if I might start with you, Sarah.
Oh, great, Rhian Marie, and thank you to the Forum for hosting this fabulous event. Well, the single most important thing that I think we can do as central banks in driving focus on this important issue of climate change is to, as you said, Rhian Marie, start greening finance. You and I quite often talk about the fact that I'm all about greening finance. you are then trying to lead the financial institutions to make sure they're financing green. And I'm sure we'll come back to that in a mo. But what I think of as the core of our responsibility as a central bank is to ensure that the individual participants in the financial system are aware of the financial risks from climate change, and that they are taking those risks into account when they make their decisions about where to invest and where to lend. That's got two really important component parts. The first is making sure they've got the right information in order to make those decisions. So that's all about TCFD. It's about the important work of the IFRS Foundation to embed it into the financial accounts. It's about making sure as well that that information is forward-looking, not just about where firms currently are, because what we need to do is make sure that the real economy is shifting its carbon emissions. That requires the support of the financial system. Greening finance and disclosure can help be clear who's moving and who isn't. So that's all about reporting. And then the second part is about transforming risk management. That's risk management at the level of the firm, the individual bank, the individual insurer, the individual asset manager, making sure they're stretching their horizons, thinking about the consequences of their decisions many years ahead. But it's also thinking about it at the level of the system as well. And that's where system-wide stress tests and scenario analyses come into play. So for me, greening finance, reporting, risk management.
Gosh, you've already covered a lot there, Sarah. Stress testing, disclosures, TCFD, the accounting with IFRS, making sure we've got the right information. I think it's fair to say that no CEO of any financial organization can credibly claim they don't realize that climate change, the risk to do with climate change, doesn't genuinely pose financial risk. I think we've got to that stage now where, you know, we understand why this is important, and it's very much what we need. We're moving into the how. You know, how do we act on this? What do we need to do? And so I guess, Sylvie, the same question to you with that in mind, the key areas of focus that you see as being central to all of this.
Well, first of all, thank you very much for the invitation, and I'm so glad to be there with Sarah, because we interact a lot, and with you, Rian Mary. Well, some times ago, I would have said that the key word would have been awareness, to make the people aware of the risks. As you said, at least in some parts of the world and by some companies, the awareness is already a step we have made. And now it's more on how to walk the talk, to be sure that we can take the right decisions. And we have, of course, to get the right informations, because there is a paradox. We all believe in markets, in market economy. We want markets to be efficient, transparent, once again, not as a goal as such, but in order to make sure that the real economy, the corporates are properly financed, that the savings are transformed into investment. But actually, we don't really have the right pricing. So everything we can do to improve the knowledge of the real situation of the companies, if they have moved or not yet enough, is very important. So we are in the phase of moving from awareness of, I would say, the big picture, the climate risk, to how can I transform my own business, and how can I make sure that I will get the appropriate financing from banks, from funds, from capital markets, in giving more and more information. So one of the key issues is information, appropriate, reliable, comparable. Also, this is maybe important in the UK-EU discussion and also worldwide, to make sure that even if we want to take our own decisions, we make sure that the systems we put in place are comparable for investors to really take decisions with being enlightened on the perspectives.
There was something you said there, Sylvie, about how can I transform my business? And I think that's absolutely key. And I really want to pick up on that, which is this idea of transition and the sort of nuanced discussion that we need to have about the harder to abate sectors or the high carbon sectors, where we need to be moving beyond the conversation of divestment or avoidance and figuring out how do we help partner with these companies who are going to need to transition to net zero. And I was just wondering whether you see the role of central banks in how can you best support that transition to greener investment? Maybe Sylvie, if you'd like to pick up on that, and then the same question to you, Sarah.
Okay, so maybe briefly, I think central banks have a role to play. There is no doubt. Of course, we should not pretend that we can replace decisions taken by elected governments. Above all, in democracies, some choices have to be made by governments and parliaments on taxes or incentives. So I leave it apart because I'm not in a government. But the central banks, they can do several things. They entered the topic, and it's thanks to Mark Carney and the Bank of England, through the risks. So the idea that climate-related risks are financial risks. So we look at it in our capacity of supervisors, but also for our own portfolio. In the Banque de France, we took 3 years ago the decision to green our own portfolio step by step. The decision was made in the Eurosystem in February for all central banks of the Eurosystem. So by doing, I would quite say we are more convincing than by just preaching. So we do it for our own portfolios. We have entered a phase of a strategic review at the ECB for the Eurosystem, where we are thinking at what could be a green monetary policy. The decision is not taken yet, so it's in the pipe. But on the rest, we already face the difficulties as well. And I don't want to lie for the people who are listening to us. It is a real transformation. It requires changes in our behaviors, in the way we price risks, which are not the risk of the past. You cannot take the data of the past and say, well, this is the way it is going to evolve. It's forward-looking, as Sarah said, and we need to see how we can figure out what is going to happen in 2050. How can we be there in 2050 with net zero emission and build, of course, the steps toward these decisions. So we try to do our part for our own portfolio. We think in terms of monetary policy. We also have our responsibility as supervisors, and here we can have an indirect influence on the financial sector. We will publish at the end of April, the beginning of May, the results of our first pilot exercise. We did not call them stress tests because it's not legally binding, but we made a lot of work with the French banking system and the French insurers to figure out what it means to implement the NGFS scenarios. And I want to pay tribute to Sarah because she's a very active member of the NGFS. So we have elaborated scenarios. Maybe in the future, we will have to improve them. It's not, but on the basis of these scenarios, we are trying to see the impact for the financial industry. And like this, we can step by step reach the transformation. And one thing is very positive is that it's accelerating. More and more asset managers, bankers, funds, insurance companies are making their part. I'm not saying it's perfect by far, but this is something that is not linear at all. The more you have people on board, the quicker it can be.
So I very much agree with everything that Sylvie has said. We start by highlighting the risk. We are clear that this is a forward-looking risk, that to properly understand it, it's not where companies are, it's where companies are going. We use our tools of scenario analysis to try and be able to differentiate between those firms that have got a plan to get to net zero, those firms that haven't yet got that plan. And that then becomes the opportunity for the financial system to support the management of that risk. Because let's be clear, Rianne Marie, I know you know this, but let's be clear, the way this risk is reduced is by the financial sector stewarding the real economy on its path to net zero. So having identified the risk, it is then the opportunity to help the real economy then manage that risk. So, and I think that's where we can start, highlight the risk, and then over to the financial institutions to work with corporates to channel investment so that orderly transition to net zero is begun. As Sylvie said, we have an important role to play by practicing what we preach and in managing our own balance sheet in this way. We have got a small corporate bond portfolio as part of our asset purchases that we do as part of monetary policy. We are going to undertake our management of that in a different way, looking forwards, that tries to do its bit in helping shepherd the real economy on that transition to net zero, not to divest, but to look to provide appropriate incentives to encourage the transition that will mean that we're on an orderly path to net zero. But just to come back to Sylvie's really important point, what we need as we try and do that is clarity on how we get from here to net zero. In some areas, that is clear. We all know in a UK context that come 2030, you can't have cars sold with internal combustion engines. We need sectoral paths across the entire economy, and then we know the road that we're driving along as well as the destination that we are getting to.
I think we're going to have to start having new analogies, aren't we? Things like the road we're driving along.
We bike.
In our electric vehicles, maybe. I just really like this point about moving from risk through to opportunity, and the fact that as central bankers you view it that way as well. And I'm just going to briefly quote the work of Professor Dan Esty in Yale University, who's done some really interesting analytical work across many, many different sectors, and looking at how climate becomes embedded in business strategy. And it starts, regardless of sector, with compliance and risk, making sure that your company is aligned with the right environmental regulations. It then moves on to setting targets. It then moves on to actually organizational structural change before you get to the fourth stage, which is when, as an organization, you realize that this is actually your brand differentiator, and that it's absolutely a source of competitive advantage for you. And I think, obviously, I'm a financier as well, but this applies equally to mainstream financial institutions as I think it does to other real economy actors. And I just think it's a fascinating journey, and one that it's great to hear central bankers talk about as well. It's very, very encouraging hearing you both speak about how you are addressing this in your roles. And here's a cheeky question: you're supervising the rest of the financial sector, but who's supervising you guys? How do we make sure that you're doing enough, and how do we make sure that the central banks are actually doing everything they could be doing? Sarah, you laughed, so I'm going to go to you first.
Oh dear. Well, look, we're completely transparent about what we're doing, right? Sylvie at the Banque de France has issued a TCFD report. We at the Bank of England have issued a TCFD report. We've said what we are doing. I've been in front of the UK Parliament 3 times talking about climate change and what the Bank of England is doing to support it. We have conversations with the corporate sector, we have conversations with NGOs, we have conversations with the financial system. So I think we are, speaking frankly, leaning in and being quite brave for central bankers here and putting ourselves out there, and you can give us marks out of 10. And indeed, I believe that there was a survey that was out where Sylvie came third and the Bank of England came forth. I'm trying to remember who it was now, but there are academics, there are NGOs out there who are very much holding us to account, occasionally by throwing fake oil on the front door. So we're doing our bit, Rianne Marie, and I encourage others to suggest where we should do more. For what it's worth, I think we have been pretty brave in what we've done so far, and that's because it's an emergency and we should do so.
Absolutely. Certainly applaud your efforts and the fantastic work that we're seeing from the network of greening the financial system in particular, that we've touched on. And Sylvie, an opportunity for you as well to highlight the work that you're doing and how we know that that's enough and that we're on the right track.
Yes, I agree with Sarah that the Bank of England is brave and we do our best. But I think your question is very important. First of all, in democracies, because, for example, in Europe, we discuss a lot the question of the mandate. You may know that the mandate of the ECB is targeted only on price stability. We are not in charge of fostering growth or employment. So the question of the mandate in a democracy is very important. And all independent authorities, be it a central bank, be it a supervisor, an agency, wherever, should actually be very careful to be transparent enough to explain to the public. And here there is a huge change in the last year. I know that the Bank of England is organizing town halls. We are doing ourselves as much as possible in terms of financial education, etc. But we have to accept to put all our action under the control of the public opinion. Sometimes it's done in a violent way and it's a little bit exaggerated, but we should always listen and draw consequences of what people are asking us, because actually they are our shareholders. Taxpayers are the ones owning the capitals of central banks, and so we should never be complacent in any way. For example, in the Euro system, Christine Lagarde goes every 3 months to the European Parliament in what is called the monetary dialogue, politicians than the next generation. But nevertheless, we should be proud of that, because at the end, the challenge of climate change and all environmental issue is to change the behavior, not only of companies, institutional, financial institutions, but also citizens, consumers. And to go back to your point, Rianne Mary, I'm confident that the consumers are going to put enough pressure on the boards to make sure that they accelerate. Because at the end, if consumers don't buy a product anymore, the company is dead. So I like this pressure coming from the consumer/citizen. We have to be very accountable to the citizen, but the consumers should also play their role, or also the shareholders in the assemblies of the companies. For example, in the bank, we have decided to participate in the votes in the assemblies of listed companies when we invest, in order to make sure that the green orientation is seriously followed.
That's an interesting point about the agency and the power of the consumer and of the retail investor. And certainly one of the initiatives that we've seen launched over the last year, the Make My Moneymata campaign, is one that I find fascinating, which is spearheaded by Richard Curtis, the renowned film producer, which is really about educating all of us that all of us that are fortunate enough to have savings and pensions, that we need to make sure that those who are tasked with investing our money are doing so in line with net zero outcomes and a resilient future, and that actually very few of us are exercising our ability to influence through making sure that our financial advisors and our asset managers are actually investing and raising questions and holding companies to account. And that's a really fascinating campaign that is actually having some real traction at getting pensions in particular to set net zero as their default. So I fully agree with the fact this is a lot to do with people's power, and using our savings and investments in the best way, which has been shown to be one of the most impactful things we can do, actually, more so than cutting down flights or cutting down on our meat consumption and other things.
Rianne-Marie, can I follow up on something that Sylvie said about grounding our work in our mandate, being brave while we do so, but grounding it in our mandate? And I think that's really important, because as soon as we leave our mandate, and we're not talking about financial stability or monetary stability or safe and sound financial institutions, then we're backseat driving, and we are taking the place of elected governments as regulators of the real economy, and we lose our license to have a voice as soon as we do that. So it's really important that we ground our work, our actions in our mandates that we have got, and we complement, we amplify, and we do not try and substitute for what is rightly government policy.
But I think that's such a powerful point, Sarah, and it goes back to the point we were making about the transition pathways and making sure that we've got clarity from government policies as to how these different industries will transform and transition, so that the financial community can respond accordingly and support accordingly. And as you said earlier, steward some of those industries through this never and completely unprecedented transition. None of us have been here before, so we're having to learn by doing. A different topic, but one that's really important, is obviously COP26 in Glasgow in November. And I just wanted for you both to touch on what your key priorities are in the run-up to COP26, and also what you hope will come out of those negotiations. Sarah, maybe if you go first.
So I cite the developments in COP also in the context of the G7 and the G20 as well. And certainly Sylvie will agree with this, I know. The amount of debate that there is across international fora generally about the topic of climate change is now at a frenetic level. So there is no doubt that there is complete focus from government, from central banks on the topic of climate change, and making sure that we continue to provide the leadership that is necessary to steward our way to net zero. What concretely do I want out of G7, G20 and COP? I want a set of commitments from central banks to do what they can, to embed it in their supervision, to undertake scenario analysis, to think about how to manage their own balance sheet, to take climate change and live it in their organizations within their mandates. I want the financial sector to be committing and taking action consistent with net zero. You know well of the myriad commitments to net zero that are coming. And then what we need underneath that is the practical steps that help us know that we're on the path to net zero, and not just making promises that we're going to turn out not to be able to deliver. And then importantly, we need clarity on climate policy from governments, and commitment about how the change is going to happen, and including that it is a just and equitable one as we get there. It's a huge agenda, but there's huge enthusiasm for it.
A huge agenda, huge enthusiasm. I love it. And Sylvie, how on a similar note, how can the UK and the EU best work together on this key shared agenda in the run-up to COP?
Well, first of all, I really believe that what we need, it's stop talking about cooperation, but beginning with something. And the nice thing this year is that you have the UK chairing the G7, the Italians sharing from the Eurozone sharing the G20, and the two countries, because of the postponement of the COP26, being in charge. So it's a kind of fantastic window of opportunity. This is the first thing I want to underline, and I really have the feeling, as Sarah said, that the cooperation is smooth and people are engaged. The fact that the US are back is a fantastic advantage. To be honest, I don't want to comment on the past, but there is such a change. So this is the very first thing. At least we have some planets that are well aligned. The second thing is that we should not forget it is a global issue. And here, the fact that Europeans inside, outside the EU cooperate well with the US is a great thing, but it's not enough. So we should really always keep in mind climate change is a global issue. It has to be solved with emerging countries, with poor countries. The ones risking the most are sometimes not the ones having created the problem, if you look from a historical perspective. And the promises we made in the past, in Copenhagen, in Paris, etc., are still there. People in the South are waiting for money to solve the problem. So this is one of the key questions. We can do a lot on disclosure of information, and I hope we can have a breakthrough at the COP26, maybe make some progress on carbon pricing, because even if everyone is saying it's tricky, it's sensitive, once again, I'm not politically in charge, but we all know in central banks that we want well-functioning markets. We want markets pricing the risk in a proper way, in a reliable, fair, transparent way. And this is not the case right now. So we have a huge effort to make. It's not going to happen within the night, but we have to continue. And my very last point is the point of enforcement. One of the key issues for multilateral cooperation is that if you just gather governments, people are enthusiastic, they make commitments, and then you leave the city where the party was, and then the follow-up is the key question. So I don't know how, but in the future, we will have to ask ourselves, how can we make sure that there is a real enforcement, be it on the financing side, being on the way we implement the decisions we have ourselves taken? Is it through standard setters for new rules, taxonomies, and disclosure? Is it with some cooperation of states? And once again, in the European Union, we have at least a system in which there is a democratic element with the European Parliament, and there is also the possibility for the people who disagree to go to the court. I know it's not very popular in the UK to talk about the Court of Justice, but at a certain point, either you have a system just based on promises, with governments changing and they make promises and nobody sees, or you enter into a system where you have some informants. It can be soft, like a comply or explain system for some commitments. But we should think in this category of enforcement of the commitments we take, because if not, we are not going to be credible. I know that Greta Thunberg has decided not to go to Glasgow, but for this generation, we have to respect the commitments we take.
The points you're making, Sylvie, I think are really topical at the moment about this principles-based approach or a more prescriptive approach. And I hear a lot from asset managers and others, their nervousness about the lack of standards, the lack of harmonization of different approaches, the fact that there are so many different frameworks and so many different reporting mechanisms and an absolute alphabet soup of acronyms out there that's causing so much confusion. And it is a little unclear at the moment, you know, whether a more principles-based approach is one that would best support, or whether it is, given the urgency of this whole agenda, something that needs to be more prescriptive and more strongly enforced. I don't know if you'd like to maybe elaborate on that a little more, on your comments.
Now, very briefly, we should be pragmatic. I mean, when people are diverging, the first step is always to define some principles, and the excellent work done by the TCFD, for example, helped to have at least a common framework. This is important. But at a certain point, once again, as you said, the funny thing is that many people say, well, there are too many norms, too many regulations. But when the regulator or the global government does not take the decision because the global government does not exist, then people complain. Where are the shared rules we can apply? And for many cross-border groups, and that's the reason why I insisted on the global dimension, it is also a loss of time if you have to cope with 20 different taxonomies, 20 disclosures, etc. worldwide. So we have to do our best. Once again, being pragmatic, if some questions are, if on some points we manage to make some things mandatory, why not? If on another part it's not ripe, then we can stick to principles. But as you said, Rhian-Mary, time is running. If we want to be ready in 2050, it's the day after tomorrow for many companies. They invest for 20 years. So we have to take some decisions now. And I'm confident that the joint leadership of, it's funny, Mario Draghi in Italy and the Prime Minister in Boris Johnson in the UK, helped by Mark Carney. So 2 former FSB chairs are at the top of the system.
And if I might add one thing to that, Rhian-Marie, you've heard me say this before, but it's better to be roughly right now, not precisely right when it's too late. So if where we are is coalescing around principles and over time we have a joint aim to get more prescriptive, I think that's fine, because this is an economy-wide global transition that we are after. So best to get the supertanker moving now rather than waiting for prescription.
So both of you with a message of pragmatism, which I think comes across loud and clear. There was one other point that was made earlier, which was about channeling capital to the global south. And I think that is a really important focus. And we know from OECD figures that we need something like $4 trillion a year being invested in emerging markets in order to meet both the mitigation for climate change and adaptation to a changing climate. And currently those flows are less than $100 billion a year. So we know we've got a big investment gap that we need to fill. And that's where possibly being a little too prescriptive here in the global north could actually constrain that capital moving to the global south, where the transition journeys are a little more nascent in some jurisdictions, not all, obviously. So I think that's a really important point to remind ourselves. This isn't just about UK and EU collaboration. This is about global capital flows and making sure that we are always conscious of that. And I just, on that note, I just really like to highlight some of the work that we're doing at the Green Finance Institute. We obviously don't have quite the levers that you guys do in the central banks, but we do use our platform to try and come up with mechanisms, innovative mechanisms that enable mainstream finance to generate new revenue streams from investing in the green transition. And one of the projects that we are working on diligently at the moment with partners in South Africa is on a new guarantee fund that we would like to see launched in the run-up to COP with the support of Western funds and Western governments that would actually mobilize domestic capital within South African pension funds and institutional investors. So not trying to blend finance so that we invest from the West directly, but so that actually we create green finance markets within country, and it's a pretty exciting project that's generating a lot of enthusiasm. So one that I'm particularly proud of at the moment. With that, I just wanted to ask a final question about sort of closing comments from the two of you about our ability to drive coordinated change across the real economy and the financial system. And I know you've touched on this a few times, Sarah, about stewardship and stuff like that, but I just, some final remarks from you on that.
So look, this is a real challenge, right? We've got to have the financial economy with central banks and supervisors directing it, and the real economy with governments directing it, all trying to move together at the same pace with myriad links across and within those various sectors. So let's be under no doubt about the scale of the challenge. I think that then goes to being open, being collaborative, public and private partnerships, real economy and financial system partnerships, national and international partnerships. And my one-liner all the time on climate change is be brave, be open, collaborate. And I think we have that in spades when we think about the challenges across the real economy and the financial system. Our work highlighting the risks, being clear that they become then opportunities, are designed to drive the right conversations. And if you start with the right conversations, then hopefully we'll take it from there. The more price signals we have, the more clarity about where we are going, the waypoints along the way, as well as the destination of net zero by 2050, the easier it will be to get there.
Thank you so much, Sarah, and to you, Sylvie.
Well, maybe a word, because we talked a lot on climate, which is our priority and at the top of the agenda in the central banks. But we should not forget, and this is very important in the global perspective, that at the end, you have people who are concerned about what you are doing. For example, on energy, it's a shame that so many people in the world don't have access to energy. You cannot have a computer, you cannot have schooling, you cannot have skilling. So the fact that we transfer money to the South would also mean not only that we work for the planet, but that we work for the people who are living on this earth. And this makes a lot of difference. It's not just a word. It's really because, you know, the goals of the United Nations, they are going beyond, you have 16 development goals beyond climate to protect the earth, and the climate is one of them. But it is also make sure that there are democratic institutions, a good governance, gender, respect for gender, and all this goes together. The fantastic element of climate is that it's such a driver of transformation that you can, how can I say, you can drag other issues with you. And one of the reasons why we should really be committed for the global dimension is that the world as it is unequal. We see it also with vaccines and access to health. We really need to keep in mind this dimension, which can be to a certain extent in our own interest, because we need to stabilize the countries in the South if we want them to have perspectives for their own development. They need some of the building blocks that fighting against climate change can bring, like new mobility, new sources of energy, and a better governance. And as Sarah said, I really believe this is also an opportunity to break a little bit the border between public and private. One of the fascinating things on climate since the Paris Agreement and even before is when people from the private sector, from NGOs, yourself, you are in an NGO, you were in the private sector, we are in public administration, that we work together, not always putting the blame on the other side, but much more trying to identify what we can provide for solutions.
Thank you so much. So I'm hearing being brave, be open and collaborate. And also it's about people as well as planet and profit. So I think we've got some key messages coming out this afternoon. I've got a couple of questions that have come in for the audience, which I'd just like to pose to you, if that's okay. The first one is, how do we see the symptoms of climate and COVID-19 crisis, and will we be able to build back better? Or are we still lacking important pieces of a green way forward? And thanks to Theodora from the Bank of Greece for that particular question. Either of you want to comment on building back better in the aftermath of the pandemic?
So maybe I'll start on that, Rianne Marie. I think kind of the pandemic has, you know, if ever there were doubt, what the pandemic has done is reminded the financial system that risks that arise in the real economy end up on financial institutions' balance sheets, and therefore they should care about them. It has also reminded them of the opportunity that they have to help the real economy manage those risks. We talked at the Bank of England about the financial system building a bridge over the COVID chasm by supporting customers through a period of economic lockdown. Those two themes, I think, are incredibly relevant and have resonance with the topic of climate change. Of course, now what we have to do is think about, as we come out of this, how can we use the opportunity to accelerate change in the economy, create good jobs, and make sure that we do build back better. But I think the environment in which this conversation is happening is incredibly helpful in a climate change context.
Now, if I may very briefly, first, the money for recovery is there, but we have to make choices. And we cannot afford to waste money in this phase. However, if you look at how the society functions, all the people who have a job, the companies producing with the carbonized method, they do exist, they are vocal. Tomorrow's society, the young children, the people to come, the new jobs to be developed, they are not heard in a democracy. So we have to make a special effort to make sure that part of the money goes to the most future-oriented activities. In the Next Generation EU plan of the European Commission, we will have to spend 37% of the money for green targets, and this is a good thing. And by the way, I say hello to the Bank of Greece.
Very good. And there's another question that's come in as well around the role of green derivatives, so credit default swaps based on climate events or swaps based on meeting corporate climate targets, and what role we think they're going to play in driving forward the greening of finance. Do either of you want to comment on that?
So what markets do brilliantly is give people opportunities to express different views. Carbon prices, those kinds of financial derivatives gives people the opportunity to express different views, and in so doing provide price signals. I think they've got an important role to play in helping provide the right signals for where money needs to go and the right incentives. But I do come back to the fact that I think we need to remember that this is a real economy challenge that we need to support. And so my effort is going to be about solving the real economy problems. And those sorts of innovations can be helpful. Rhian-Marie, you're involved in voluntary carbon offset markets. Again, they can be helpful. But the key is to drive the change in the real economy, because that is how you get emissions down, and that is the outcome we need.
Well, you know that I'm an ardent believer in what you've just said, and that the purpose of finance and the focus of finance is very much on ensuring that we are financing the transition and actually primary investment in what we need to see in the real economy. Financial stability is incredibly important. Climate stability is even more important, if we can put it that way. So I fully agree with what you just said. And Sylvie, any comments from you? But
no, the only thing is we all have a problem. We don't disagree enough, I suppose, for a debate. So please, Rhian-Marie, try to find a question on which we can disagree. No, on this very specific point, creativity in the finance can be part of the solution, but we should be very careful. Remember the great financial crisis and read Mark Carney's book, Value and Values. At the end, the thing which matters is that we provide good solutions, as you said, for the future, and not just that some people make money with very sophisticated products without links with the real economy. But it's not disagreeing, it's what you've said, so I'm desperate.
We'll have to work a little bit harder to find something to disagree on. But I think with that, I think our time is unfortunately coming to an end. So I think it's just up to me to Thank you both for all the work that you're doing in this space. Two fantastic role models that are really leading the way. And it's such a cause of optimism to hear all the work that you're doing. And with that, I'd like to hand back over to Nick Collier.
Thanks. Well, thank you all for a terrific discussion. And thank you very much, Sylvie and Sarah, for giving us the time. And it's great to see that you agree just about on everything, and you're cooperating, you know, both in the NGFS and in the run up to COP26, and indeed in the G7, of course, for France and the UK. And Rhian-Marie, that was brilliantly chaired. Thank you so much. For members of the forum, you'll get a replay of this in a couple of days, and then I think it will be on YouTube probably next week sometime. So again, thank you all on behalf of the forum. This is a great example of where you were forward-looking, you were positive, and we didn't mention the B word once, which is terrific. And just a final plug, really, for those of you who are interested in the subject and perhaps a bit new to it, do take a look at take a look at the NGFS website. I think it's ngfs.net, isn't it? I think
That's right.
Yes.
Hosted by Sylvie's colleagues in the Banque de France. Also take a look at the Green Finance Institute, which I think is greenfinanceinstitute.co.uk, I think. And there are events in the run-up to COP26 which are open for people to join. That we were just discussing before we came on air. There was the Green Horizon Summit, which Mark Carney really led in November when we would have had COP, which we physically hosted actually in the City of London. Terrific event with, I think Rhian-Marie was saying, hundreds of thousands of people logging onto it. Quite impressive. And there will be a series of smaller events, which I think Rhian-Marie, you and the WEF and we probably are running with Mark Carney starting, I think, next week. So that is under the website, the Green Horizon Summit.com, I think, greenhorizonsummit.com. So please do take a look at that. So that's all from me. Thank you all very much, and have a good day. Thank you. Bye bye.
Thank you. Bye bye. Thank you all.
Thank you.